We're going to be talking about GMO labeling. GMO labeling is a regulation, but it isn't part of the approval process. For example, in the United States, approval of GMOs is done through regulations by EPA, USDA, and Food and Drug Administration, FDA. That differs from labeling. Labeling in this case requires food that contain GMOs to contain a label indicating that they have GMOs in them. We are going to cover 4 topics: the regulatory history or brief history, arguments against labeling, arguments for labeling, and then a couple of observations on my part. Turning first to regulatory history, EU and US differ, and still do for that matter, differed in food labeling requirements. It used to be that, and still is for that matter, that EU did not require labeling, US did require labeling. And by labeling I mean that if a product included GMOs, then that product would have to be labeled as such. In the United States, on several state ballots, there were referendums for popular election, and this included Vermont, California, and several other states. There were referendums put on ballots, and those referendum would require food labeling. Those referendum, most of them did not pass, but one did in Vermont. Recently, the United States passed a food labeling law, and that was signed by Barack Obama and was signed into law on July 29, 2016. This law that has passed and is now the law of the land does several things. First, it rescinds state laws. So the Vermont's law is rescinded, and now there's one law across the United States. Many have argued, and I would certainly agree with this, had not one of the states passed a food labeling, GMO labeling law, the U.S. would not have passed one either. The food industry, and particularly food processors, want one law, one set of regulations across the United States, so the fact that there was one state with one law gave impetus for passing the U.S. law. We are still in the rulemaking stages on that law, and FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, is writing those rules. In the text of the bill, or the law that's now passed, they have 2 years to finalize those regulations. So if you go to the store, you will not see any GMO labeling in the United States. FDA has 2 years, so we could expect to see some final rules in place next year or in 2018. The mandatory law will require GMO labeling, but it won't require the method for the labeling, and there will be at least four methods allowed. One is words on the package, simply indicating that that there are GMOs in this product. A symbol, and presumably there will be one symbol that will be applicable to all products. That symbol hasn't been developed yet. An 800 number or a QR code. Here are some examples of what those might look like, or those labeling requirements might look like. This happens to be put out by, as you can see here, one that's opposed to the labeling law. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see in the circle there, artificially produced with genetic engineering. I can guarantee you that will not be the wording on the package, but words to that effect. And then to the right, a QR code. Many of the proponents of labeling were not happy with the end result of what was required with labeling. The QR codes and the 800 number in particular were problematic to those groups. They said that it would be hard to find out whether or not those products included GMOs, and that it should be much easier to find out whether those products included GMO codes than having to look at a QR code and looking it up. So we still don't know what foods will be required to be labeled, so what we're going to be talking about is speculation here. Um, FDA is in the midst of their rulemaking process. We won't know what that will look like until they announce those rules. It's highly likely that they'll announce a preliminary set, people will make comments on it, and then they'll announce a final set. But here is an article from Modern Farmer, and it gives you an idea of what those food labeling laws might be like. Going through this brief section of that article, you'll note here that the agricultural crops that will likely need labeling are corn, soy, soybeans, canola, and sugar beets. Sugar beets are modified, so those are the crops in the United States, at least at this point, that will require labeling. If a product includes those products, then there will be a labeling requirement. However, but as the FDA points out, many highly refined products that come from genetic modified sources, such as the oil from soy and canola, will not have to be labeled because they don't meet the law's definitions of bioengineering. So, even though, for example, that vegetable oil that's 100% soy oil may not have to have a GMO label on it because it doesn't meet the requirements set forth in the law. Also, it's sort of interesting, moving down, my understanding is that many common types of food ingredients, such as oils and sugars, will be exempted from labeling under this law. So corn syrup, soybean oil, and sugars will be exempt from this labeling law. This is a further section from that Modern Farming article. Vegetables such as sweet corn, papayas from Hawaii, and yellow squash, those vegetables that are produced with GMOs in them or GMO modified crops, will require labelings. However, meat, milk, butter will not. So those meat products where the animals likely fed GMOs will not require labeling. The proponents for labeling were not entirely satisfied with this law because there are some products that they would feel that should be labeled that are not. And the proponents or the opponents of labeling were not entirely happy with this law either. So why are those opposing labeling against it? And it should be noted, as you would expect, the big 6 seed companies were against labeling, as well as many farm groups. American Farm Bureau, National Corn Growers, American Soybean Association, National Wheat Growers Association, all opposed labeling. And I've divided the arguments against labeling into 3 parts. The first is a functional argument. There is no difference in the foods. GMOs are as safe as non-GMOs, so why should we have to label them? And to a large extent, the literature has not found a safety problem with GMOs, so why are we labeling them? Producing GMOs with GMO technology is a process, so why do we have to label that process? The second argument is that labeling requires traceability. So if you want to label corn or a corn product as non-GMO, you're going to have to trace it. Our commodity-based system is not, in general, designed to trace products back and forth. Here is an example. You see Anderson's Elevator, which is located west of town here. Each one of those bins will hold corn. Generally speaking, it's commodity corn. If we want to get in the business of tracking non-GMO and GMO, well, then we would have to segregate that. And the question then is, who bears the cost of that segregation? Right now, there is GMO-free corn that you can purchase, but the segregation costs, there's premiums for those, and those costs are borne by the individuals that do that segregation, and the customers in the end will have to pay payments for GMO-free corn. If there's a labeling law, all of a sudden there is not that cost is borne by everyone. The third reason is, and this is again opposing GMO labeling, that GMO labeling is meant to scare consumers. That the reason why we want those GMO labels on there is not to inform users, but to scare users. So what do the proponents of labeling put on their side? I took the following arguments from an article listed as Massachusetts Right to Know GMOs. So you see the website listed there at the bottom, and they made 6 arguments in there for why we should have labeling. The first of those is that there is widespread public support for labeling. And if you took a poll and asked whether a consumer would want labeling or not, they would likely say yes. And there would be over 50% of them that would support GMO labeling. Second one is right to know and need to know, in that they would argue again that while there are no studies that find health problems, there are no long-term studies. So we still need to know whether we have GMOs in the food supply or not. Their third argument would be that it has no cost to consumers or producers. Obviously, that would be something that the opponents would argue against, and in fact, I would disagree with as well. If we do have segregation, we will have cost. Their fourth, fifth, and sixth points are fourth, support local agriculture. Fifth, mitigate environmental risk, and their risk would be ones of insects developing, for example, resistance, and other pests developing resistance to the GMOs themselves. And then the sixth point, support food democracy for the free market. Those last 3 in particular are more sociological or systems oriented. They want to support a type of agriculture, and there would be, I suppose, implicitly opposed to the existing agriculture. So they would view this labeling as something that supports the development of an agriculture that they would prefer to see developed. A couple of observations of mine here. First is that there has been a number of labeling efforts proposed in the past. For example, if you look at any of your clothes purchased in the United States, there's a made where tag on that clothing. You can see where it's been made. We had efforts to have country of origin labeling on meat, and then there's also nutritional labeling on food. Whenever we have some of these labeling efforts, there's almost always some action that the proponents want to cause in the consumers. For example, the made on labeling tag, it was supposed to be something that encouraged purchasing garments made in the United States. So almost always when we have these labeling efforts, the proponents want something to happen on the part of the consumers as a result of that label. That label may not have the desired impact, and often doesn't, but there is often a desired impact. Second observation is that there's, in my mind, a key difference between voluntary versus mandatory labeling. If someone wants to know something, there's always voluntary efforts to put that product on that labeling on the product. For example, there could be a voluntary effort to have processes that produce foods without GMOs. Labeling as such would be voluntary efforts, and that's different from mandatory efforts, which is what is now passed in both the U.S. and EU. Final observation is there's not a lot of trust on both sides of this debate, and the proponents of GMO labeling don't trust agriculture or the big 6 seed companies, and agriculture doesn't trust the proponents of labeling. And in particular, you can see from the last 3 points, 4, 5, and 6 of the arguments for agricultural or GMO labeling, why the individuals within agriculture would not support or do not trust the efforts of the labeling individuals. Our reading this week is Want to Know If Your Food is Genetically Modified. That's an article from The Atlantic, and in my opinion, it does a very nice job of laying out the sides of the debate. So take a look at that article. It's a pretty easy read, and that will provide some background on GMO labeling efforts. Our review questions for the week are the module, and thanks for listening to this module.